Since we met last, I've been trying to think about a way to visually give you a sense of the types of theism that we've been looking at. I think the fundamental thesis that Spong is talking about is that just our understanding of God and God's relationship to the world has to change. And he's been using words that that I've worked with my whole life, but I don't know how they sound in your brain. uh, and so I wanted to try to visually represent or to give you a sense of what we're talking about when we try to model the ways that God is related to the world. And I came up with this. I found this um, on the internet, and I think it was the best way to talk about Spong's approach. However, up here you see this word dualism, and what I would like to do, I almost did not use this graphic because of it, but this is represents what Spong, for the most part, is talking about when he refers to theism. This idea that God is removed from the world and that God, breaks into the world in certain ways, but especially in the form of miracles or in the form of the incarnation. But there is a kind of a separation. There's a certain separation between God and the world, which frankly is not biblical. But the way uh, our theology has developed over the years, and primarily as a result of the influence of Greek philosophy, theism has come to be the primary model by which we think about how God relates to the world. But there are many other models, and they can get very complex. So starting over here at the left, and please note the colors on these, okay? You've got the universe in yellow, and you've got God in blue. And then when we get down to panentheism, you see what happens. But the idea of atheism, which is as untenable as a belief in theism, really, there's no proof that there's no God, nor is there a proof that there is God. So, um, because of that, I've always thought that agnosticism was you can be a faithful agnostic, uh, and especially if you tend towards the intellectual side of things. Agnosticism simply means, this idea, you can see the Greek word gnosis in here, that we have no knowledge. We have no specifically concrete knowledge about God. Now, Spong is going to disagree with that. He's going to say, we may not have concrete observable knowledge that the sciences like to rely upon, but we also have to refer to at times our inner experience. And this, for Spong, is what we need to go on in the 21st century as we try to reform our understanding of God and God's relationship with the world, and the 12 theses he's laid out. Uh, so knowledge of God can come through inner experience. And then there's something that is usually associated with the Eastern traditions. And I think it's really a misunderstanding, but I'm not going to go into that. But it's called pantheism, in that the universe is God, that the sum of the parts of the universe represent God himself. So God and the universe are equal, are one. Um, that's not what Spong is talking about, but I just wanted to touch on it here. Then there's something that I wanted to make sure that we talked a little bit about, because it's very important for the understanding of theology that our humanistic founding fathers had. And that is that God is a God who created the universe, but set the universe in motion and did not really have any need to uh, break into the universe for any way. This is called deism. And the image that's often used is God is the watchmaker. So God puts together this highly intricate creation, sets to motion the laws of nature, and then we as human beings can understand something about God by reading the book of nature. This is where Isaac Newton was in the 17th century. Isaac Newton saw himself as a natural theologian. Instead of reading the book of scripture, he read the book of nature. By looking at how the universe works and the laws of nature, we could understand something about the complexity and the perfection, if you will, of God. But this idea that God breaks into the universe in any kind of way or breaks into creation in any kind of way is just absent from the idea of deism. Even as I say that, some deists believe that there were times when God had to come in and kind of wind the watch every now and then. But for the most part, creation moves on its own, and we are here to understand through our use of reason. And this, by the way, is where we get, from our founding fathers. We hold these truths to be self-evident, right? We can use our reason to understand truths about who human beings are, what the natural world is, but we don't need God to reveal it to us. With theism, you have the idea that we human beings, especially in our state of original sin, in our state of ignorance, you might say, not just ignorance, but sinfulness, depravity, as John Calvin called it. If we are to know anything about God, God must reveal that. And that revelation has come most perfectly in the form of the incarnation, in the form of Jesus Christ. This is straight up John Calvin. This is straight up, especially Karl Barth. And this primarily is Reformed theology that's been with us since, it's a type of theism that has been with us since the 16th century and even before. But this is specifically what Spong is reacting against. And what he's offering for us is something, though he doesn't really come out and say it, but behind the scenes, he is arguing for a type of theism called panentheism. And that is the idea that all the universe is within God, but God cannot be reduced to the sum of the parts of the universe. God still transcends, but in such a way that God is not ever removed from the universe or from creation itself, but all things are happening within the being of God. God is the ground of being. So you can see the universe in yellow over here. You can see the God in blue. When those two things come together, they form this color green, right? So God infuses all things, but God still transcends. There's still a blueness to God that we can see in this. I hope that little historical lesson is helpful here, but if I would like to get a better image than this, but this is the best one that I could find. This idea that God is the ground of being, and that this ground of being, God can be known through being in a variety of ways, especially when it comes to human character. All of us, however many, 10 or 12 of us, we all have our character, but they're all manifestations of God. And our commitment to each other, this is where we get into what Spong was talking about last week, is to be positively predisposed towards ensuring that being is enhanced in all things, and that enhancement comes through love. And so this is where we've left off, where we really started to get into thesis number 2 about Jesus. But any questions or comments about this? Or points of clarification that I can make?
Dan?
Yeah, Will?
Well, I love your graphics, but pantheism versus panentheism, all is God, God is all.
Yeah.
Could you say just another example of the difference there?
Okay. Uh, are Think about yourself as a human being. Are you just simply matter in motion? Are you just simply, there's something about you that your being transcends just the sum of your physical parts, right? Uh, we call it a soul. Uh, and in panentheism, it's as if the, the the transcendence of God is like the human soul. It's that immortal part of us that cannot be reduced to the functioning, at least according to some people, cannot be reduced to the functioning of matter in motion, electrons and tissues and organs and all of those things that come together. That there's something beyond us towards which we aspire, and then gives us a sense of eternal identity. In pantheism, and this is why this is a misunderstanding. I don't think truly in other world religions there is a true pantheism. I think in all the other world religions they're talking about panentheism, but for historical reasons I won't get into, uh, this has come to be leveled against other world religions as being uh, uh, oh, reductionistic, and that's actually not the right word I'm looking for, but as being I'd as tending towards idolatry. You know, those Hindus over there, they think that little statue is God, or they think everything is God. That's I don't think that's true. So this I probably shouldn't have even introduced pantheism here, because technically I think panentheism is what many of the world's religions are talking about, especially Hinduism. This is where Christianity ultimately gets it from. So try to forget about pantheism over here. It's something that's leveled against other world religions to to try to proclaim their hedonism, let's say, yeah, and try to. But this idea that God is the eternal being in which the universe is continually being created and is continually in flux. Uh, the universe has being because it rests in the ultimate being of God. And I don't know if that makes sense to you or not. It's difficult because we have to completely switch around the way that we think about God is up here and we're down here. No, this is the idea of if you want to look for God, you look for God inside. And this is a movement that really came to gather a lot of strength in the 19th century with Romanticism and an interest in mysticism and an interest in human experience as an arbiter of truth. This is why Spong is putting so much emphasis upon this idea of experience. Any other, sorry, Will, I probably took more time than I needed to than that.
No, no, thank you very much.
Any other comments about this? Well, speaking of the universe, I wanted to introduce you to one of my favorite quotes from Albert Einstein. Two things are infinite, the universe and human stupidity. And I'm not sure about the universe. He's sure about the infinity of human stupidity. Einstein was great when it came to quotes, but as you know, the question of whether the universe has boundaries or not has been one that's been a part of astrophysics for a long time. But there are no bounds to human stupidity, according to Albert Einstein. So, well, that's just kind of a review of where we were talking about with God, but this is the foundation of everything that Spong is going to later build on, I think. And just as by way of review, because of the theistic understanding of Jesus, that Jesus is this, if I can return to my, Jesus is a breaking in of God into the universe to become incarnate, to become enfleshed. It no longer fits the model that Spong is trying to work with. And so he is going to, excuse me, he's going to argue against the idea of the incarnation. that we can't think of Jesus as God becoming enfleshed, or at least not in the way that we have in the past. And this is the place where it's very, very ambiguous, because in some ways Spong is arguing for Jesus as the place in which God becomes most perfectly manifest and enfleshed, you might say. But in the past, what we have done is we focused on those things that are so central to our creeds. We've committed what's called a theological idolatry, that we hold fast to these ideas that Jesus is 100% God and 100% man, that there was no mixing of essence, and all of these things that mark the Christological controversy, and that remain in our creedal statements. Spong says, let's not idolize those things. The incarnation basically is nonsensical now if we set aside a theistic universe or a theistic understanding of God. But the experience of Christ, coming back to experience again, right? What was that experience of Christ that our earliest recorder, or our earliest recording of an experience, coming from Paul? What was that experience of Christ? And can we come up with new language that is relevant to our current context, that can provide meaning for us? And this is where I would like to say, instead of just jettisoning, getting rid of the incarnation, it becomes we should think instead of a new way of thinking about incarnation. What Paul's experience is that God was in Christ, but not in a way that Christ was absolutely God, that God was a concrete presence in Jesus himself, but in the actions of Jesus, in the lifestyle of Jesus, in the teachings of Jesus. We have a point in history where the presence of God becomes, I want to say incarnate, where the presence of God becomes evident to us in no uncertain terms. And what does that presence look like? And here's where we get to Spong's very long quote. Can the divine be seen in the human? That's where we must begin. And then, what was there about Jesus that lent itself to what is now thought of in the strange language of incarnation? It was, I believe, the breaking down of all the boundaries and the barriers by which we human beings separate ourselves from one another. The power of God seen in Jesus was the overcoming of all of our fears and divisions. God was the power of life, the passion of love, the ground of being that draws all lives into a new humanity. This is very challenging, because what it does is it sets aside the exclusive uniqueness of Jesus as the presence of God, as the incarnation of God, the only place where God can be seen perfectly. And I think what Spong is saying here is that there are places in the evolving of the universe and the constant flux of God's creation where our barriers that separate us break down, love breaks through, and we experience an empathy and a love for the other that naturally does not exist in the way that we've evolved as human beings. And wherever that happens, Christ is present. That's how I'm understanding this. I don't know that it's the right way to understand it, but the way that Spong works in this chapter, it just seems too brief for me and does not give enough. It's a very low Christology, like I say. For Spong, I just wonder if Christ is necessary at all, right? And I'm having a little hard time with that. I think for me, I'd like to hear Spong say, Jesus is the places where that most perfect manifestation of the breaking down the barriers of that separate human beings takes place, in which we can do that and we experience it, however imperfectly. I'd like to hear something like that, but he's not saying that. Can I ask if, first of all, we're all on the same page with what we think Spong is saying? And second of all, do you have any response to that? I hope I'm
Yeah,
as
Dan, we've read over the years some of these and confronted some of these issues. I would suggest you could also ask the question, when he says, is Jesus necessary? The flip of that is God necessary?
Yeah.
I mean, then you have the notion of the atheist Christian. What's wrong with that?
Yeah. 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 Right. Well, I think it's a way that we're creating a new mythology, right? That helps us understand our experience. We have experience of anxiety, we have experiences of being excluded and things like that. But we do have times when something happens, when something miraculous happens, where human beings actually set aside their own self-interest and work for the interest of others. How do we explain that? Because we don't often see that in nature. Spong's going to put a lot into this idea that naturally we have evolved to survive, and the way we survive is we create differences, and we create others against whom we have to compete. But God is that presence that helps to break down that boundary. But one thing that we do know, this is kind of a Cartesian approach to it. One thing that we are sure of is that we have being. The one thing that Descartes was sure of is that he could think, well, in a Cartesian way, we're saying we are sure that we have being, we exist, we experience being. And there are aspects of our being, and that being is grounded in God. There are aspects of our being that enhance our lives, and there are other aspects of our being that do not enhance our lives. Those aspects of our being that enhance our lives are what a God of love. And this again, why, biologists tell us love is a completely self-serving thing. It has its own natural selection. What am I trying to say? Objectives to it. So you're right, Mac. I mean, I'm flailing here to try to explain. We're hanging by a thread in terms of just completely getting rid of theology altogether. I don't know. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I guess my answer is I don't think Jesus is sui generis. I mean,
Right.
the concept of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, we've studied enough to know that was developed over, a number of years from a number of traditions. And so, there has to be at some point, I think, at least a spark that comes from the ground of being that we recognize as something beyond our universe in your panentheism
Yeah.
graph.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the key. Now, Jesus is the key player there. And maybe he's not the only key player. Maybe you could have that same religion with Mother Teresa. I don't know, but
Yeah. But
Jesus
there,
seems to be where we have developed, and probably for reasons.
Jesus is the place where the human self-conscious, if we imagine that self-consciousness as a species is developing, then Christ might be that place. Jesus might be that place where the self-consciousness reaches a new level of understanding in which, barriers become barriers begin to break down all the more easily. The other thing about this, a ground of being we have a difficult time putting personal attributes to it. One thing that is very distinctive about the Christian tradition is the personality of God. We pray to a God who is like us, who suffers as we do, who loves as we do, and things like this. The ground of being tends not to have that. You don't pray to the ground of being in that way, right? That's something that's distinctive of theism. There is, however, an author, a Jewish author, as you might expect, by the name of Martin Buber, who was writing towards the end of the 19th, but mostly in the early 20th century, who talks about the relationship of I and thou. The one place where we come to know the presence of God is in this recognition that takes place when, and it's a kind of barrier that breaks down when we recognize the other not as an object, but as a subject, just like me. And that's the foundation of love. And that cannot happen apart from a God who is also personal, who breaks down similar barriers with human beings. So that's where I go for the personal God, but it takes us further afield than where we need to be right here. But this explaining things, I wonder if we're going, this reformation that Spong wants to put forward, I wonder if it's going to end up so thin that it is just going to be one step away from getting rid of it completely. I hope that's not the case. But it's certainly an interesting intellectual exercise that we've got going on. Other comments about this? Well, Spong throws a chapter in that I think is a little redundant about something he's already said, but I wanted to use this opportunity. He talks about the collapse of salvation story as being really the result of the whole Darwinian revolution, understanding that human beings were not created perfect in the beginning, but that evolution, scientific evolution, has been happening over millennia and millions of years, and has been happening by what appears to be a somewhat arbitrary contextual mechanism called natural selection. People or things adapting well to their environment, but also through mutations, right? But there's nothing about it that ever seems to be really directed by the hand of God. Well, that really undermines this whole idea that human beings are the special creation of God, in whom God is delighting. So how do we, this is why evolution is such a difficult difficult thing for people to handle, We've been told from the beginning that we've had dominion over the earth, and the earth, we were created in the image of God, and the earth is ours, and we're to be fruitful and multiply, and God's really depending upon us, right? There was that story in the garden where we fell from perfection, and now we need to get back to that original state. But there was no perfection if we look at evolution, and there was no dominion, really. I mean, look, 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs were the ones that had dominion, right? And where were we? But just tiny little mouse-like creatures, mammals, who after the asteroid, the meteor hit, those mammals were able to regulate their temperature in a way that the reptiles were not. And so begins a whole new stage of natural selection, adapting to an earth that's no longer as hot and consistently hot as it used to be, which served the needs of the reptiles. Seems so arbitrary. And Spong actually says that this meteor may have been the size of Mars. I can't even fathom that. But anyway, we also are being told that we're not so special that our DNA, and this is something I have a hard time with the creationists, we share 99.9% of our DNA with the great apes. We share a lot of our DNA with things as incidental as clams, as Spong points out, right? So there's a structure of life of which we are a part, and we are not even, it does not appear to be the most important part. We're not special. But in all of this, how do we account for evil? Before I go there, Spong has his own, which I kind of a two-dimensional, I think it's two-dimensional response to this, but it's important for what he's going to develop later. But before we get into this, since Nebraska is kind of on a positive ascent these days with a new vice president candidate, Tim Walz hails from Nebraska. I also wanted to introduce another Nebraskan who maybe you know about him, but very few people that I know do know about Loren Eiseley. Have you all heard of Loren Eiseley? Yeah, I can imagine some of you have. But this whole story, Eiseley, he was an anthropologist, grew up in Nebraska. In the 1930s, spent a lot of time in the sandhills and was digging up a lot of, the dinosaur bones that just seemed to proliferate up there, right? But became so well versed in, the anatomy and anatomy, I guess, of anatomy of the bones, or anatomy of these reptiles, that he became an expert. And he never even got a PhD, but he ended up being the head of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. And the thing that made him really so special is that he was able to tell the story of evolution in a narrative way that was very understandable. And in the 1950s and the 1960s, this book itself, the Immense Journey, written in very short and captivating chapters, I find, engaging chapters, talking about how minor little things set the course of evolution in a new direction. How flowers changed the world, is one of the names of the chapters there. He talks about a moment in history where the human brain grew in a geological instant. But he's a scientist who sets people to wonder. And for someone who's a theologian, who can also read about evolution and still wonder and not be completely discouraged in the whole, reductionism of it all, he's a wonderful author if you've not read him. And so he actually spent some time in his childhood in Aurora, Nebraska. Tells a story about, wandering the sewers as a child, the underground sewer system. And one day they were getting rid of, how you clean out the fire hydrants. Well, all this water came rushing through the sewer while he was down there with one of his friends, and they barely got out alive. So, well, in the midst of this evolutionary story, Spong says the idea of incarnation just doesn't make sense. We were never perfect. We never fell from perfection. We don't need to be redeemed into a state where we are, perfect once again. This idea of the need for God to become incarnate, as is supported by our traditional theology, just doesn't make sense anymore. He also raises the question, how do we account for evil? How do we account for the bad things that happen in the world? And this is where his anthropology really turns towards science. And he says, if we think about the immense journey of evolution, the one, I guess, the one directive that all living things, all things that have being, share is to survive. And when you get into the higher animals, one of those survival techniques is to be, to create a sense of self over against a sense of an other, a sense of collective self in the, in the community over against the other collective selves over there. And there are limited resources that you have to compete for. And so it's very easy to begin to look at the other, whether it's another individual or if it's another, tribe, as the enemy. That is our natural biological state. It's not a fall from something. It's just the way we've evolved. And if you add to this what we know about the way humans are brought into the world, and there's a short gestation period in the womb, but there is a kind of gestation that takes place for 2 up to 3 years outside of the womb, where the child has to be cared for, every moment of the day, right? And that child cannot help but think, because of the care, that they are the center of the world, right? And we have to unlearn that part of ourselves for the rest of our lives. This is something that Spong doesn't mention, but it's something that can also be added to that evolutionary narrative that's told. Because of the care that is required of a young child who is helpless in the world over 2 to 3 year period of time, that child eventually in its life has to unlearn this idea that seems natural, that I'm the center of it all, right? So selfishness, which interestingly is very similar to what we talk about. And when we talk about the myth of original sin in the Garden of Eden, but the self-centeredness is what leads to evil in the world. This is what Spong is introducing here. He doesn't develop it completely, but he is asking us to think biologically. How do we overcome our determinism, if we might say, as selfish people bent on survival? Does that square pretty well with your understanding what Spong is getting at, everyone?
And Dan,
Yeah, go ahead, Denny.
so much of what he is saying and what you're just saying, I think anthropologists would say, really came about with the invention of agriculture and irrigation,
Absolutely.
because hunting and gathering societies that dominated the human experience for hundreds of thousands of years
Right.
were not faced with scarcity in the way we think of it. And therefore, their interaction with strangers was far more amicable and far easier. The big fear was, being ostracized from a tribal unit,
Right.
and, and literally fed to the lions. That was capital punishment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Rather than other human beings, because of that scarce interaction.
Right.
And, there was plenty, when population density and the ecosystem were complementary with each other.
Right. And this is why I think at least the introduction of this idea at this point in the book is a little bit two-dimensional, a little bit thin, right? Because what happens with agriculture, the introduction of agriculture, is now you have excess stuff, right? Now you have stuff to have to protect, and now we don't want those folks to get our stuff, and so we're going to have a warrior class that's going to defend ourselves against this. And it's, in other words, it just kind of spirals out of control. The selfishness grows upon itself. But even in hunter-gatherer societies, I think, lest we turn them into this kind of romantic pre-lapsarian group of people, which some people do, right? there was selfishness among those people, I'm sure, as well. What happened with agriculture was it just became kind of uh, institutionalized to the point where we are today, where selfishness is, and competition and all of those things that are so foundational to free market capitalism have brought us to where we are, right? Um,
Uh,
there is a tendency among some ecological thinkers, though, to think of the hunter-gatherers as, the noble savage, right? And I think what Spong would say to that is that there is just in our being, right? The way we are in the world, there's a natural tendency towards selfishness because we want to survive. I come first, you come second, right? If you come at all. Go ahead, Denny. I see that you're wanting to jump in.
I would disagree a bit because cooperation for most hunter-gatherers was absolutely imperative for survival. They were facing hostile environments in terms of the animal world and the elements. They really had to cooperate in terms of division of labor and on, or die.
So let me ask, just to push you a little bit on this, is that a kind of, are you making the noble savage argument then, that this is a kind of a prelapsarian paradisical existence?
I'm not
Where
sure.
there is no
I'm
sin.
not sure about the paradise because, um, there was always a need to reach out in terms of hunting, and the prey were not always amenable, not seldom amenable
Yeah.
to the primitive tools that they had. So they were living kind of on the edge
Mhm.
and do it.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I would, say it was any kind of a paradise, except in the Pacific Northwest. There is, because of the currents and the the plenty of, for example, salmon,
Mhm.
and the ecology, um, made that pretty much. If you want to talk about paradise, you know, that would be it.
Yeah, Lewis and Clark didn't have much fun up there. They got tired of eating salmon, but but I know what you're saying, right? Yeah, there's abundance, right? And with abundance, competition and selfishness tends to not get fueled as much.
Right.
Um, anybody else want to comment on this? I do want to point out, you might remember in when we were talking about our last book, I introduced something called an Irenaean theodicy. And that was, an explanation about how evil comes into the world. Um, and the typical theodicy is that there was original perfection, we fell from perfection, and then we needed to be redeemed through the coming of Christ and the death of Christ on the cross, and that reconciles the world to God. But another theodicy, and of course evil in that is a result of our sinful condition. Another theodicy suggests, and this comes from Irenaeus in the 2nd century and is found in the first chapter of Genesis. It talks about human beings being created in the image and the likeness of God, that we're created in the image of God, but creation is a continuous process. Dare I say, evolution? Creation is not something that is complete, but is in flux and moving towards a final moment, what might be called the omega moment, right? And in that moment, when we become all in all, when we become fully in God's presence, we will become the likeness of God. We will be like God. So all of history is this movement with the help of the Holy Spirit towards from image to likeness. And it's not just human beings, though they are kind of like at the top of the ladder, so to speak, but it's all of creation itself. When creation will become all in all, so to speak. There were attempts after the introduction of Darwin to try to bring an Irenaean interpretation to Darwin's theory of evolution. And I think, the most elaborate of these was a theologian by the name of Teilhard de Chardin. And it was Teilhard de Chardin that talked about this movement, towards this omega moment. And he was an evolutionary, I think he was an anthropologist, if I'm remembering correctly. Unfortunately, he was discredited because he was part of a scheme to try to, I should have researched this before, but a skull was found in China that was actually two skulls put together, and they thought it was, one of the original Australopithecines, maybe. I'll remind myself what that was all about, but he's been discredited. But his theology, nevertheless, was founded on this idea that creation is moving towards, and directed by God in this movement, and Christ was the center point of that movement as well. This is closer to what I think Spong is talking about here. Our next thesis really builds upon this, and we'll talk about this next time as it's close for us to go. But, we've been talking about theodicy. How does evil come into the world? It's traditionally been explained through original sin. Everything would have been fine if that darn Eve hadn't offered the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, or fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of good and evil, if she had not offered it to Adam, right? And so Spong is going to develop this story a little bit as we move forward. But his thesis on original sin is just this. The biblical story of the perfect and finished creation from which we human beings have fallen into original sin is pre-Darwinian mythology and post-Darwinian nonsense. We have to find a new way to tell the old story. And I wish he would not use this word mythology the way he has, because it lends itself to thinking it's just a bunch of mumbo jumbo. But mythology is the key to understanding this story, as far as I'm concerned. And I want to talk about that when we return. And we'll be delving into people like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, whose series on the power of myth was very influential. I think it was back in the 90s when that came out. But there's nothing wrong with mythology unless you misuse the term. And I don't think Spong is misusing it here, but it's very easy to be misinterpreted as it's being used here. So the next time when we come back, we will look at original sin, get a little, reminder of how all of that came about, the theology of original sin, because it's foundational to our theistic understanding of the world that Spong wants to challenge. So I think it's a good place for us to stop. Are there any final words before we move on? Well, that's our slide for next time right there. So, okay, well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop the share. And, a lot of this stuff is review for many of us. And if you feel like I'm going too slowly, please let me know. And then the reason I asked, because I'm having a wonderful time walking down memory lane. This is such graduate school stuff for me. And just remembering a lot of the authors that, that could be read in conjunction with some of these ideas. So any
Review-
final thoughts?
Review is good.
Yeah, well, thank you, Denny. I appreciate it. Oh, but I want to also mention next Wednesday, we are having our new faculty, or I shouldn't say our faculty orientation. And so I'll be busy all day on Wednesday. So I'm sorry about that. We'll have to meet next time in 2 weeks. I might come up with maybe a little assignment for you, maybe a YouTube video or something. But anyway, sorry about that. So 2 weeks from now, we'll pick up with original sin.